Hi there. My name is Gregory Pardlow. I'm a poet and an essayist, and the author of Air Traffic, a memoir of ambition and manhood in America. My memoir is centered on a fairly historic labor strike involving the Air Traffic Controllers Union, of which my father was a member in 1981. Writing about this strike allowed me to think deeply about my perception of my father and how that perception served as a blueprint for my understanding of manhood and masculinity. It also required me to think about my relationship to history and what that says about my relationship to the present, as well as my relationship to the future. The strike was such an impactful moment in my father's life, and by extension mine, that it divided our lives into two parts, before the strike and after. Using the strike as a centerpiece, then, gave me a way to think about time. It was just a happy accident that, in the process of writing, I discovered the real question I wanted to answer was where my father's story ended and mine began. But what if I'd started the memoir at the moment I was born? How would that have influenced the structure of the book? I discovered that I still had a lot of anger toward my father. How could I do justice to that anger without letting it overshadow my love for him? These are the kinds of questions I'm going to ask you to think about as we go forward. We can't expect to answer these questions definitively, but we are going to develop some strategies that help us address them as comprehensively as possible. Toward that end, I'll give you specific writing assignments, some of which you will share. Occasionally, I will also give you short writing exercises that I'd like you to do on your own. This will be very low-stakes writing, just to get you thinking through particular ideas and challenges. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the art of the frame. This is giving context to memories. First things first, though, I want to say it really makes no difference whether you pronounce the word as memoir or memoir. Either way, it's still French for memory. A memoirist wants to record and to translate memory into narrative. Not all memories come to us gift-wrapped in cultural significance and metaphorical meaning. They have to be crafted into compelling and pleasing forms. We can transform a memory into a narrative and still leave the reader thinking, so what? How do we make that narrative compelling? How do we choose which memories to transform into art? And how do we make those memories relevant beyond the context of our lives? We do this by considering the big questions: who, what, how, and why. The who part, presumably, is already answered by virtue of the form. But hold on. If we get started on a memoir, taking for granted that the primary subject of the work, you, is so obvious that it goes without saying, then we risk focusing on our external experiences alone. In that case, the work becomes a collection of stories about the people and the places that we've seen. It becomes more journalistic. For the reader, that's like seeing someone's vacation photos without really learning anything about the person who took them. Writing autobiography, memoir, personal essay, these require at least a self-interest, even if self-awareness is in short supply. Your memoir should be driven as much by a need to discover as it is by a desire to reveal. If you're anything like me, you might feel self-conscious about potential navel-gazing or obsessing over your own strengths and flaws. This is a valid concern. So what is the difference then between self-indulgence and self-interest? Self-indulgence occurs when we think of ourselves outside of our social context. Our identities are formed in relation to others. This is what makes memoirs so compelling. Readers of memoirs are trying to figure out productive ways to relate to others. Readers of memoirs are interested in seeing how you relate to your social context, which means that you should be interested too. Ultimately, you're giving the reader new ways to view their relationships and new ways to evaluate their life choices. Now, the what question may seem obvious too, but we can give that deeper consideration as well. You'll need to figure out what kind of personal narrative you actually want to write. Forms and conventions are not clearly defined by any means. I don't suggest this is a science, but there is a range of possibilities. On one extreme is autobiography. On the other extreme, let's say, is personal essay. Your project probably falls somewhere in between. It may even jump around or even make use of multiple strategies throughout. I'd like to put these on a line to give us a way to think about and talk about what we're doing on the page. Autobiography knows what happened and only wants to tell you. Think about the autobiographies of Ben Franklin or Frederick Douglass. The point of an autobiography is to chronicle an exemplary life, a life that might serve as a model of virtue and character. You're probably quite familiar with memoir, but I will say that memoir is often organized around a specific event or theme. Conventional, that is, commercial memoir, wants to work out questions of identity and self-image. Classic examples are Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, or Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. Personal essay is less interested in recording or reckoning, but in pursuing often unanswerable questions and making literary art out of the material of one's life. Personal essays intend to provoke, move, and delight the reader. Once we've figured out to some degree what we're going to call the work that we're doing, it'll be helpful to consider the possible ways to organize that project. There's so much to consider in this regard. What verb tense are you going to use? Will you write in the first person? First person plural? The royal we? That could be fun. Second person? Third, even. Do you think your project will be lyrical or more rhetorical? In other words, are you mostly interested in delivering us, that is, via your senses, to the times and places that you're recalling? Or are you making some argument about, say, the pursuit of health and happiness, or what constitutes a life well lived? Whatever the case, the deal is that the reader will get to see you at work making sense of your life. Research is going to be very important in a number of ways and throughout your entire project. Research can help you clarify your own memories. If, for example, the car company didn't make convertible models of your high school sweetheart's car until after you graduated, then you couldn't have gotten rained on while driving around that night after the prom. Also, try making a timeline or a list of important dates. Consult things like your high school yearbook or staff directories, funeral programs, obituaries, and local newspapers. In other words, think creatively about the kinds of resources that can help you fact check and corroborate dates and events. That process can turn up rich and culturally meaningful period details that you might not have otherwise thought to include. If your memoir is centered on a particular event, read popular magazine articles from that time period. Magazine articles are great because they can give you a feel for what people valued at a particular time and the spirit of that age. Just as fashions change, so do people's perceptions around what's beautiful and what represents success, for example. Personal identity changes over time too, right? What it means to belong to a particular country or community often depends on what that group organizes itself in opposition to. And that's a big part of any story that gets lost if you're looking solely at your own experience or solely at the experiences of the person or people that profoundly influence your life. Research can also help you create context and widen the lens on memories that might otherwise be of interest to only a narrow set of readers. Readers can be made to care about just about anything if the writing is compelling. But you might broaden the window of empathy. That is, you might create more ways for readers to connect to your frustration, for example. If we knew that you were fighting to protect your urban neighborhood garden at the same time that students were protesting city schools, for example. Of course, you can get carried away with research because it's fun to make surprising connections between seemingly trivial or random events. Who was that chief of police at the time? What were the hit songs? Who invented the leg warmer? But you want to do this research in moderation, what I call memory lane research. It can bring you back to times in your life that you wouldn't have recalled on your own. Research is a powerful tool for generating material and not just for discovering. You can get absolutely lost in the rabbit holes of internet searches if you're not careful, which is another kind of self-indulgence. But at least your reader doesn't have to be party to it. When I was writing Air Traffic, I needed to find a picture of a specific toy car to confirm that I was describing it correctly. 2 hours later, I could have written an entire memoir around the toys of my youth. It was an incredibly nostalgic experience, but nostalgia is one of those things that's disconnected to a social context. I mean, my nostalgia now has no impact on or relevance to my experience as an adolescent boy. We can think of the writing as occurring in two fundamental stages: the generative stage and the revision stage. The generative stage is a free writing stage where you just want to get the words, the memories, out onto the page. The generative stage should be intuitive and messy. Many of the questions that we've been asking so far may even get in the way when you're just generating the material. And if that's the case, then leave those questions aside until you begin working on revisions later. On the other hand, you may be the kind of writer who likes to work from an outline. In that case, it would be helpful to answer some of these questions in advance. In fact, the questions themselves might be generative, depending on the circumstances. If you do want to begin with free writing, I suggest writing for a set amount of time. If you determine that you're going to write for 3 minutes or for 5 minutes straight, you're probably not going to be very self-conscious about your grammar or word choice, and that's a good thing. Fear of sounding dumb or of making mistakes is lethal to the creative process. The point of free writing isn't to produce good writing, but to produce new ideas. In order for that to happen, you have to be able to surprise yourself. No one has to see your free writing but you. Even if it doesn't allow long-buried memories to surface, free writing is a great way to start your writing day by getting your ideas moving. When you do get to the revision stage, you'll need to figure out what to sacrifice. So much of the editing process is just admitting to yourself which of the many amazing stories that you've produced in the generative stage really aren't that relevant to the scope of the project as it comes into focus. That's another question. What is your focus? Well, let me suggest this. It's possible that you don't know the focus yet. Even if you may be pretty certain about the events that your memoir will be centered on, I recommend staying open to the possibility that you may discover compelling themes and patterns in the process of writing that you hadn't anticipated before you began. Ultimately, your memoir should feel coherent, even if it doesn't have a specific point. And it should suggest a rationale, even if there is no real moral to the story. If you're inclined to approach the writing in a formal, structured way, by answering very specific questions and making detailed plans, or by starting like someone spinning a globe and setting out towards some great unknown, don't be afraid to experiment with both approaches throughout your entire process. I'd like you to try a brief writing exercise on your own. Choose a historical event of at least national significance that occurred during your childhood. What social and cultural conditions were directly impacting you and your family at that time? Without placing too much emphasis on the event, write 2 or 3 paragraphs about your life at that moment. You won't be turning this in, but I do want you to work through the process of using an event as an entry point for your life story. This week we're going to talk about creating an avatar. In a lot of ways, the messenger is the message. Right? So one of the tragic consequences of being confined to a single body is that we'll never know what other people experience when they meet us for the first time. I can't know how someone will register the slight change in the atmosphere that my presence causes when I enter a room. I'll never know what it's like to be in my company. And what is truly unfortunate, in light of all this, is that as a memoirist, I've chosen to make myself the primary subject of most of my writing. As a memoirist, I've chosen to study someone I can never objectively grasp or represent on the page. But there are ways to cultivate a kind of out-of-body relationship to the self that does get on the page. The essayist Philip Lope talks about creating an I character. And I think of this I character as an avatar of myself. That's the messenger I create to deliver the stories that I've made from my memories. Basically, I'm talking about voice. Voice is the messenger that we send to greet the reader. We can craft voice the way one might craft a social media identity. Voice can conjure an entire world in a few phrases, a few images or references. The question is, how do you want to be represented on the page? So let's think about creating an avatar. Anyone whose speech has marked them as an outsider to the community where they live or work, whether that's by a dialect or an accent, a speech impediment or a stutter, these kinds of things. Anyone who has worked with these knows all too well how much information we communicate through voice alone. We can't presume that our narrator is universal or transparent to the reader, however transparent it may be to us. For example, when Hannibal Lecter meets Clarice for the first time in Silence of the Lambs, he draws a rough biography based only on the qualities of Clarice's voice. What kind of information do you want to give or withhold from the reader? What might the reader infer about you from the signals, the clues you embed in your avatar's voice. Remember, your reader has no idea who you are and is starting from scratch, building a psychological profile on you. This may sound intimidating, but it also gives you a profound opportunity. When I was in college, I worked in telephone sales. I was pretty good at it. I remember my first discovery was that the customer could somehow hear me smiling over the phone. Then I discovered that with every call, I could influence and guide, and okay, some might say manipulate, the customer's responses to me just by altering my attitude, my tone, the speed at which I spoke. Now I can produce equivalent effects in my writing by altering things like my word choice, idiom, and syntax. That is, the order I place my words in. For example, take a sentence like this. Once again, I found myself reluctant to face the work week. Now compare that to a sentence like this. Monday, ugh, what a drag. I'm no less myself in either case, but it has a considerable effect on the reader's impression of me, my mood, and my disposition. Your relationship to your avatar is super important. Some people have difficulty talking about this because it sounds too, new agey or too much like therapy. But I consider it a craft issue. See, no one is entirely objective. Everyone has biases, and that's not a problem. It only becomes a problem if the reader can't get a good sense of how reliable you are. Like you, your reader has her own built-in BS detector, or bias detector. The reader needs to have a baseline understanding of your cultural assumptions, your beliefs, your values. This is in order to evaluate your relationship to reality. Your reader will go along with you as long as she understands that the speaker that you're crafting for the page is, say, a curmudgeon, a saint, a social climber, etc. Which means that you have to be aware of those characteristics too. I had a colleague once in an undergraduate writing program where I used to teach. His name is Aaron Ritzenberg. And Aaron came up with this exercise that I'm going to share with you, which I absolutely love. I've been using it for years. I want you to take a look at two passages written in wildly different voices. I'd like you to think about all of the information that we can glean from the text about the personality of the speaker. What do you think he or she looks like in each instance? What are the clues? Okay, so this is passage 1. If Esu Elegbara stands as the central figure of the Ifa system of interpretation, then his Afro-American relative, the signifying monkey, stands as the rhetorical principle in Afro-American vernacular discourse. Whereas my concern in chapter 1 was with the elaboration of an indigenous black hermeneutic principle, my concern in this chapter is to define a carefully structured system of rhetoric, traditional Afro-American figures of signification, and then to show how a curious figure becomes the trope of literary revision itself. My movement, then, is from hermeneutics to rhetoric and semantics, only to return to hermeneutics once again. Now, we might agree that this person is probably a stodgy, pipe-smoking professor, someone with elbow patches on their sport jacket, regardless of gender. I know it gets tricky when we start making guesses or assumptions about identity, race, class, gender. We don't like to talk about it because it feels a little impolite, but trust me, readers are making those assumptions. And if we don't, we can come off sounding naive. I'm going to read passage 2 now. We always had a gas stove in the kitchen in our house in Piedmont, West Virginia, where I grew up. Never electric, though using electric became fashionable in Piedmont in the 60s, like using Crest toothpaste rather than Colgate, or watching Huntley and Brinkley rather than Walter Cronkite. But not us. Gas, Colgate, and good old Walter Cronkite come what may. We used gas partly out of loyalty to Big Mom, Mama's mama, because she was mostly blind and still loved to cook, and could feel her way more easily with gas than with electric. But the most important thing about our gas-equipped kitchen was that Mama used to do hair there. The hot comb was a fine-toothed iron instrument with a long wooden handle and a pair of iron curlers that opened and closed like scissors. Mama would put it in the gas fire until it glowed. You could smell those prongs heating up. This speaker is much more personable, approachable. She or he is of a certain age. We can tell this by the references to the news anchors. The speaker is almost certainly African American. It's kind of a toss-up as to gender, though, right? That we can't say with confidence creates an interesting kind of tension that the author might be playing with, might be toying with our expectations around gender. The interesting thing here is that these passages are both written by the same author. They're written by the renowned scholar and cultural critic Henry Louis Gates. Which of his avatars would you rather hang out with? So let me ask you, how do you represent yourself in a professional setting? How do you differentiate between you when sitting for a job interview, for example, and you when meeting your significant other's parents for the first time? These may both be formal situations, but they don't call for the same kind of formality. What kinds of changes would you make to your script if you had one? Now I'd like you to try a little exercise. You can do this as a thought experiment, or you can work it out on paper. You won't be turning this in. If you're writing it out, I don't think you should write more than 250 to 300 words. Pick out something you do routinely, something you imagine many people like you do as well. Without addressing anyone specifically, describe that activity to readers who are not familiar with your culture. Perhaps they're from another planet entirely. People for whom that activity is, well, alien. Now I'd like you to rewrite the passage in a voice you would use when chatting with friends and neighbors in your living room. So how do these conditions affect your choices in diction, syntax, imagery, and idiom? What happens to the work when you assume your reader is familiar with the activities you are describing? Think about how this might affect your memoir, and what effect might your assumptions have on your reader. If your reader is the alien, and you assume they know everything you're talking about, you risk alienating them even further. If your reader's life, value, and habits are very similar to yours, and you go into excruciating detail about banal things, you risk coming off as condescending to the reader. I don't want you to think that either way you lose. No, the opposite is true. Be aware of how much influence you have simply by calibrating your relationship to the reader. Remember, it doesn't matter what your story is. If you're not presenting yourself to the reader in a way that is deliberate and empowering, then you're asking the reader to do all of the work in managing the relationship. And that's no fun for anyone. This week we're going to talk about diegesis. It sounds like an intimidating word, but it's not. And frankly, it's not all that important. But the idea is really important. In our previous unit, we talked about imagining the speaker that you craft on the page as an avatar. This helps us gain some objectivity on how we come across to the reader. Now I'd like to talk about your avatar's relationship to time. Think of it in photographic terms, as in depth of field. We know a photograph is two-dimensional, but a skillful photographer can create an illusion of depth and multi-dimensionality. Many writers create this effect intuitively. I admit I am not one of those writers, and neither, I suspect, was Aristotle, because it's Aristotle who gives us the term diegesis. Or was it Plato? Doesn't matter. Anyway, diegesis is a concept that isn't usually applied to memoir, but it can help us think about the ways we give our narration context and depth. Diegesis is everything that takes place within the world of the story being narrated. In memoir, we can think of it as the memory that gets translated into story. In memoir, the extra-diegetic frame is the level of exposition. It's the voiceover, we can think of it as, that comments on and helps the reader understand the memory. The frame surrounds the text and gives it coherence, guides the reader, offers relevance, and gives language to experiences you wouldn't have had the words for at the time. As the narrator and main character of your memoir, you'll be moving into and out of the memories that you recount. How will you transition between your various functions? And what will that look like on the page? Sometimes the difference will be very, very subtle. I might write something like, "Even in the winter, Dad would barbecue on the weekends. I used to love the steaks he grilled." That sounds like a statement made from the frame that points to a generalized activity in the past. Now let's compare that to something like, "Dad came in from the yard kicking snow off of his old sneakers and set down a tray of sizzling meat from the grill. I savored every bite." I think the difference here is a little more than showing versus telling, because it involves a kind of proximity to the action. If your memoir remains at the level of exposition throughout, it may feel a little more distant, like a report, which is fine if that's the effect that you want. If, however, it remains at the level of story throughout, in the memory, it'll read more like fiction. But the writing puts on weight when we can feel like we're moving between now and then, sometimes making use of the wisdom and insight that we have now, and sometimes shedding that wisdom for the sense of wonder that we felt then, before we knew what would happen next. You can find examples of this everywhere. I just found one example in Mary Karr's memoir, Cherry, when Karr relates the time her childhood friend Clarice climbed up a goalpost on a football field. Once Clarice got up on top of the goalpost, she performed an act of such daring that it delighted and amazed Karr for years afterward. Karr begins telling this story at the level of the frame, the extra-diegetic frame, or voiceover. Then she moves us into the memory, and then back out. In my edition of Cherry, it starts on the bottom of page 32, where Karr writes, "That sight of her squiggling up the yellow pole magically yanks the memory from something far off into a kind of 3D present. I'm alive in it. There's early frost on the grass, and my ant bites itch. Clarice's limbs have turned to rubber as she wraps round the pole. She's kicked off her keds, so her bare feet on cold metal give purchase. About a foot at a time, she scoots up, hauls herself by her hands, then slides her feet high. And again, she's weightless as an imp, and fast. Then Carr goes on, but to summarize it, basically, when Clarice does her thing, it causes an adult to come running over to stop her. Then Clarice shimmies back down from the goalpost, and all the kids who were there watching scatter. It's at that point that Carr brings us back to the frame in order to make sense of the memory. She writes, "Decades later, I asked Clarice point blank why she did it. We were in our 40s then, living 2,000 miles apart, and talking, oddly enough, on our car phones." I'm skipping ahead a little bit. The answer that she gave remains the truest to who she was and, this is important, who I then so much needed her to be. "Because I could, I guess," Clarice said. "Wasn't anybody to stop me." Now, if this were fiction, we could easily imagine this taking place all on a single level of narration. Carr would just tell the story and the reader would get to make sense of it. But if Carr did that, then our attention likely would be on Clarice instead of Carr. If Carr only told the story, we'd be left to figure out the complex character of Clarice when what we want is to figure out how Clarice influenced and contributed to the complex character of the author. It's important to let your reader know why you're telling them certain stories and anecdotes. There are lots of outrageous things that happen in everyone's lives that make for great stories at a cocktail party or around the dinner table. But you don't want to spend 300 pages recounting your wild adventures without explanation. After a while, the reader is going to wonder, what's the point? This is another example of the difference between being self-indulgent and being self-interested. If your memoir consists of stories in which you braved danger and performed acts of heroism, unless you're seeking some truth about the nature of heroism and fear, then sure, that's going to sound self-indulgent. Remember, time, as much as language, is your raw material. Don't be afraid to get creative with it. You can also collapse the frame into the story to create a hypnotic effect, much as Yusef Komunyakaa does in his poem, Venus's Flytraps. I am 5, wading out into deep sunny grass, unmindful of snakes and yellow jackets, out to the yellow flowers quivering in sluggish heat. Don't mess with me, 'cause I have my Lone Ranger 6-shooter. I can hurt you with questions like silver bullets. The tall flowers in my dreams are big as the First State Bank, and they eat all the people except the ones I love. They have women's names with mouths like where babies come from. I am 5. I'll dance for you if you close your eyes. No peeping through your fingers. I don't suppose to be this close to the tracks. One afternoon, I saw what a train did to a cow. Sometimes I stand so close, I can see the eyes of men hiding in boxcars. Sometimes they wave and holler for me to get back. I laugh when trains make the dogs howl. Their ears hurt. I also know bees can't live without flowers. I wonder why Daddy calls Mama honey. All the bees in the world live in little white houses, except the ones in these flowers, all sticky and sweet inside. I wonder what death tastes like. Sometimes I toss the butterflies back into the air. I wish I knew why the music in my head makes me scared. But I know things I don't suppose to know. I could start walking and never stop. These yellow flowers go on forever, almost to Detroit, almost to the sea. My mama says I'm a mistake, that I made her a bad girl. My playhouse is underneath our house, and I hear people telling each other secrets. This is, in essence, a persona poem. In other words, Komunyakaa uses the 5-year-old character as a mask. The poem employs a literary device called dramatic irony, which is produced by the tension between the mask and the poet. So we know, for example, that the adult poet is trying to make sense and art of his childhood and is using the child's perspective to achieve a kind of time travel. He's moving from the frame into the memory. Even though he's able to transport himself back in time, he can't shed his adult wisdom, and we don't want him to. Lines like, "I wish I knew why the music in my head makes me scared," allow us to explore the child's wonder and fear, even though we know the action described in the poem concluded long ago. This is an economical way to give the reader the texture of the child's experience. What else do we notice about the poem? What is Komunyakaa doing technically that creates that hypnotic time travel effect? We notice that the poem is in present tense. We also notice the child's grammar. I know things I don't suppose to know. And sentence structure. Notice how many sentences begin with I, followed by a very straightforward verb. As poets do, Komunyakaa is performing the crisis that his mind keeps bringing him back to. My mama says I'm a mistake, that I made her a bad girl. We have to extrapolate what that must mean for the adult 30, 40 and more years after the fact. And the weight of those years is all the justification we need for why this is worth revisiting. And if we're still concerned about what is or is not self-indulgent navel-gazing, I'd argue that this presumably autobiographical poem can only come off, I think it can only come off as self-indulgent to a reader who refuses to see their own unforgiven child selves in the boy voiced in the poem. A reader like that is probably not going to be reached by anything we write anyway, so there's no point in really worrying about them. A coherent frame inspires trust in the reader. It suggests the author is in control, even if the narrative voice is in crisis. Moving between the frame and the memory also gives you room to establish a margin of error around your memories, indicating which details are more confidently remembered and which ones are just part of the general atmosphere of the time. Moving between frame and memory allows you to highlight what concerns you the most. Being able to move between the memory and the frame also tells the reader that the emotional content of the memory has been processed and demystified, at least to some extent. Whatever is in the memory may still be scary or overwhelming, but we've done the hard work and now we see the past with some clarity. If you're narrating from the extra-diegetic frame alone, you're kind of limited to either unrepentant confession or a kind of past progressive abstract relationship to the action. In other words, I call this the woulda, coulda, shoulda level of narration. It sounds callous, I know, but it works for me. Whenever I notice my level of narration staying within the frame, I can usually attribute it to some version of this statement. I admit I suffered or did this awful thing in the past, but I won't explore the impact that it had on me and others because I'm still not quite over it, and yet I want you, reader, to give me credit for having simply mentioned it. See, confession is like apology. It doesn't really work without taking responsibility for the past. If you don't, the writing will likely be unfulfilling for the reader, however therapeutic it may be for you. One way to make it more fulfilling for the reader is to bring the past event or action vividly to life by moving from the frame, where you can only talk about the thing, into the memory itself. Remember how Carr says the image of Clarice squiggling up the yellow pole yanks the memory into a kind of 3D present for her. I'm alive in it, she says. Well, when you're alive in the memory, the reader will appreciate that you're not just trying to make that reader share in your unprocessed feelings. Rather, you're genuinely trying to reconcile or at least wrestle with the past. And in that process, you're modeling the kind of courage and care that it takes to come to terms with the things, frankly, we all have in our pasts that for whatever reason continue to haunt us. I mean, think of the great confessions, right? St. Augustine delivers us ringside to each infraction and sin, not for the sake of spectacle, but for that reconciliation. We understand very clearly that he is not now the same person he was then. And we understand that difference because he can move into and out of his memories. They don't exist for him in an eternal present. You know, it's easy to tell ourselves either that our experiences are so trivial or banal that nobody will be interested in what we have to say, or that our experiences are so horrific or shameful or absurd that if we commit them to paper, we'll be exiled to a prison colony on some uncharted island. But the truth is, the reason we write memoirs and the reason we read them is that they reassure us of the commonality of the human experience. The Roman playwright Terence said, "I am human and nothing human is alien to me." The reader isn't relating to your experience because she has had similar experiences. She's relating to your experience because she has had a similar relationship to her own experiences, if you understand what I mean. And there's a flip side to this. There are some readers who will indulge in a kind of false empathy by claiming to identify with a memoir because they too come from the same region of the world where the author lived, or because they too own the same model of bicycle that the author did as a child. I say this is false empathy because the reader who does this is contending with the author's past instead of their own. I'm not saying this is wrong. It's very safe to read that way. But if I may, I'd like to suggest that you shouldn't write with that reader in mind because it will limit your ability to see beyond the superficial to what really is universally human in your work. So now we're going to talk about the various relationships you create between your avatar, your speaker, and the other people in your work. Maybe you know the joke from the movie Annie Hall. Guy says to a psychiatrist, "Doctor, my brother's crazy. He thinks he's a chicken." Doctor says, "Well, why don't you turn him in?" Guy says, "I would, but I need the eggs." There are illusions that keep the peace in our families and communities, and so often we participate in keeping up those illusions. It's often easy and convenient to depict ourselves as either passive witnesses or as the targets even of other people's whims and desires. The savvy reader knows that there's no such thing as a non-participant, especially in a family drama. Complicity is normal. There's nothing wrong with that, except when we depict the people around us as being unilaterally responsible for the joy and suffering in our lives. What attracted you to the wrong crowd to begin with? Why did you continue to indulge or enable the abusive or selfish or emotionally unavailable or all of the above person? What was your stake in the situation? In other words, what were the eggs that you thought you were getting? When we're handling other people's points of view, we want to consider whose story you're telling. And if you're telling it, then ultimately it's your story. But if ethically you feel you need to tell the story from someone else's perspective, then you might ask yourself why you need to tell the story in the first place. Consider what you stand to gain or what you're preserving by employing a perspective other than your own. This most often comes up in relation to family, when we want to tell a loved one's story. It's easy to forget that the reader only cares about our loved one to the extent that we do. You may think the world needs to know about the inventions stolen from your father and the credit he never received. But the drama in that story resides in your desire to avenge him. I'd like to read a poem for you that I wrote. It's called Wishing Well. It taught me a lot about the role of other people in my work. The poem describes an experience I had outside the Metropolitan Museum. A man approached me, a man I took to be down on his luck in some way, and he asked me for money. A number of things happened after that, which I detail in the poem. I'll read it, and then I'll talk about the genesis of the poem over many, many drafts. Wishing Well. Outside the Met, a man walks up, sun tweaking the brim sticker on his baseball cap, and he says, "Pardon me, old school," he says. "You know, is this a wishing well?" "Yeah, son," I say sideways over my shrug. "Throw your bread on the water." I tighten my chest, wheezy as Rockaway beach sand, with a pull of faux smoke from my e-cig to cozy the truculence I hotbox alone, and I am at the museum because it is not a bar. Because he appears not to have changed them in days. I eye the heel-chewed hems of his pants and think probably he will ask me for 50 cents any minute now. Wait for it. A smoke or something. Central Park displays the frisking transparency of autumn. Tracing paper sky, leaves like eraser crumbs gum the pavement. As if deciphering celestial script, I squint and purse off toward the roof line of the museum aloof as he fists 2 pennies from his pockets, mumbling, and then aloud, "My man," he says, "hey, my man, I'm gonna make a wish for you too." I'm laughing now. "So what, you want me to sign a waiver?" He laughs along. "Ain't say all that," he says, "but you do have to hold my hand and close your eyes." I make a starless night of my face before he asks, "Are you ready?" "Yeah, dog, I'm ready." "Sure?" "Sure, let's do this." His rough hand in mine inflates like a blood pressure cuff, and I squeeze back as if we are about to step together from the sill of all resentment and timeless toward the dream source of unneeding. The two of us hurtle, sharing the cosmic breast of plenitude, when I hear the coins blink against the surface, and I cough up daylight like I've just been dragged ashore. "See now, you'll never walk alone," he jokes, and is about to hand me back to the day he found me in like I was a rubber duck. And he says, "You got to let go." But I feel bottomless, and I know he means well. though I don't believe, and I feel myself shaking my head no, when he means, let go his hand. So in early drafts of this poem, I kept trying to figure out what was wrong with this crazy guy who came up to me out of nowhere and basically asked to hold my hand. As I was writing the poem, I kept trying to figure out what was wrong with that guy, because his actions seemed so strange and random. I can't tell you how many drafts I went through trying to make sense of the weirdo guy before I realized that the real question was why I was so willing to go along with him. Once I asked myself the question, what were the eggs? I could see that the real weirdo in this scenario was me. That is, once I asked the question, I had to admit to myself that I needed him more than he needed me. That's when the line appeared that broke open the poem for me. The line that reads, I am at the museum because it is not a bar. I could have written a sort of funny, snarky poem that spoke to the crazy things that happen in New York City. But I wouldn't be telling the reader anything she didn't already know. I think the poem I did write is riskier, more intimate. Whenever possible, it's good to interview the people who will play a substantial role in your memoir. This will not only give you a chance to find out specific information from their point of view, it'll give them a chance to show you how they would like to be represented. Even if you choose to depict them in a way that does not agree with their ideal self-image, it will be helpful to know how they see themselves. By that same token, you don't want to assume that your loved one or best friend or family member has the same effect on everyone else that they have on you. You may think people remembered your big brother for years because he was a rebel and a renegade in high school. But it's entirely possible that people continued to talk about him because they thought he was a jerk. Similarly, just because you couldn't see how super cool your little sister was, you can't rule out the possibility that her peers really did like her. Try to temper the necessarily biased opinions you have of the people closest to you by perhaps admitting to a certain margin of error. Again, it's important to remember that the reader doesn't care whether your assessments of other people are accurate. I'm really talking about family here, but when we're writing about anyone with whom we have a long history, we have to find ways to resist the impulse to write about them as if we can read their minds. So it may seem quite obvious to you that your mother picked you up early from school that one day when you were in 5th grade because, I don't know, that was the day she was finally overcome by the grief of having lost her favorite pair of earrings, and she could not spend another minute at home by herself. So you may feel like you know this beyond certainty because, having witnessed a lifetime of her behavior, you feel you have the evidence to support that assessment. And you may be right, but it'll seem like a stretch to the reader. Instead, you can just show her losing her earrings in one scene, then show her picking you up from school in the next. Or you can do the work of actually explaining what makes you so certain about her motives. However you do it, and whenever possible, let the reader either draw the conclusion for themselves or let the reader see how you arrive at your conclusions. Composite characters make things actually a lot easier for the reader. If you grew up with a large group of really close friends and several siblings, parents, step-parents, it might get a little challenging for the reader to keep track of everyone. It may feel like you're being dishonest, but really, when you're bringing characters together to make a composite character, it's a service to the reader. Sometimes other people are better suited to talk about certain aspects of your life than you are. I say let them. Many, if not most families, have a self-appointed keeper of secrets and family lore. Your reader is likely to trust that person's word because, let's face it, being the keeper of family secrets is a thankless job. No one wins awards or gets promotions for how well they keep their scrapbooks, albums, and oral histories. They're probably in it for selfless reasons. It may not be necessary, but it's good to have that person to credit and to support any of your claims that might seem implausible. People are complicated, right? We all have flaws, not necessarily because we're bad people, but because we exist in time, and by virtue of that fact alone, we're bound to behave in contradictory ways. If you depict someone, particularly a family member, as entirely good or entirely bad, you're only going to undermine your own credibility. The reader is going to wonder what prevents you from seeing that person as a complex human capable of a range of qualities. The reader is going to wonder what you're hiding. So we never say so much about ourselves as when we talk about other people. Profiles often say more about the author than about the person being profiled, or at least as much maybe. First, there's the fact of the choice of the person to profile. Why have you chosen this particular person when there are millions of other people just as worthy of your attention? Intuitively, of course, it may be obvious to you, but it's worth thinking through. The reader understands that you have chosen this person because they mean something to you. They represent some human quality that you want to celebrate or criticize or otherwise examine. Let's talk about the ways we capture the speech of other people. Dialogue is usually made up. We may recall the shapes of arguments and interactions, or the key turning points and insights in a discussion. But it's unreasonable and a little silly, really, to pretend that we have remembered at length conversations verbatim. The reader understands, or at least should, that the best a memoirist can do is approximate conversations we've had or been party to in the past. Include dialogue not to document anyone's testimony, but to give the reader a sense of how people interact, their mannerisms and habits of speech. In addition to quoting, you can also approach dialogue through summary and paraphrase. Think back to our discussions of diegesis and the extra-diegetical frame. We can say that quoting takes us into diegesis, into the memory itself. But much of what we recall about what people say or have said to us long ago can be relayed in the frame through summary and paraphrase. A statement like, "My father would always tell me to keep $1 in my pocket." This is a statement that comes from a frame. Or, "I remember how she used to cuss whenever she lost her patience." Right? We don't need to hear exactly what was said. It's taken care of efficiently in the frame. When the specific wording is important, or when you want to give the reader an example of the pace and style of someone's way of speaking, you can take us into the specific memory, where we can hear the person for ourselves. But if you're making a point that doesn't have to do with what someone says specifically, you can give us that quickly and efficiently through summary and paraphrase. We've covered a slew of really fundamental questions that you might want to ask yourself before you begin and as you're writing your memoir. Remember, these questions can come in handy to use as prompts, whether you're in the generative stage of just getting things down on paper or screen to work with later, or if you're in the revision stage, where you're refining the work to find an overall theme or focus? The answers to these questions don't have to be shared with the reader, not necessarily. In most cases, it's a good idea to explore, for instance, the biases built into the relationship you have with the family members you choose to write about, or your relationship to a particular event in your past. But the results of those explorations are primarily important to you in your writing process, behind the scenes, so to speak. It's up to you whether or not you want to make that work explicit to the reader. Thanks so much for your attention and participation. Of course, we've barely scratched the surface here, but I hope what we've covered so far helps you situate yourself in a way that feels comfortable and true to you and your project. You have so much more to discover in the lectures that come. Just remember, there are no hard and fast rules. Stay open to surprises, and above all, keep writing.